you remember having staring competitions as a child? Two people challenging each other to see who can keep their eyes open the longest without blinking? Well, I'm actually going to ask you to do this now. Now, you don't have to stare into someone else's eyes. You find a spot on the floor or the wall, or you can stare into this lady's eyes. And I want you to see if you can hold your eyes open for as long as you can without blinking. Go. And while you're doing this, I want you to think about what's going on inside your body. What do you feel? It gets harder the longer you go, right? The urge to blink builds. You can suppress it for a little bit, but eventually you can't hold back. It's all right, you can stop now. Our body has a number of these physiological urges for action. Things like sneezing, coughing, yawning, swallowing, and blinking. These are natural, daily physiological urges where there is a build-up of an urge that's relieved upon the execution of that action. So what does this have to do with Tourette's? Tourette's syndrome affects close to 1% of the population. It's characterized by sudden stereotyped movements, motor tics, or vocalizations, vocal tics. These tics can be simple, such as a little twitch or throat clearing, or they can be complex tics, such as the stereotyped uttering of socially unacceptable words, or even dangerous behaviours such as headbanging or punching. It often starts in childhood and adolescence, but can continue throughout the lifespan and has a significant impact on the social, the school and occupational functioning of these individuals, decreasing their well-being and increasing risk for suicide. Now, historically, the clinical assessment of Tourette's has focused on these external behaviours, the number and frequency of these tics. However, tics are also often accompanied by an invisible symptom. This term is called premonitory urge, and it stems from the word premonition, a sign of things to come. And while it's not part of the diagnostic criteria, it's now widely accepted that they accompany tics. The problem is these premonitory urges are subjective phenomena. All right? They're only experienced internally to the individual. And so without any external behaviours, they're difficult to measure and they rely on first-person reports. I'm going to change gear now. So I am a cognitive neuroscientist. I use brain imaging to try and understand our brain and our behaviours. Given that we try to map the brain, I'm going to give you a bit of a mapping metaphor for how we try to understand brain health. So let's take, for example, this town, Town A. We have 3 residents of this town that have presented to the council complaining of the same symptom of a flat tyre. Now, to try and understand what has caused this flat tyre, we try to look for commonalities in the location of these individuals. And we track where they've gone, and Mr. Purple has come down here to the supermarket, Miss Red's gone here to the hospital, and Miss Blue has come here to the basketball stadium. And what we see is that there is a common overlap in a small portion of their tracks. And when we inspect this area, we find a large pothole. So damage or a structural alteration to a specific location has led all 3 individuals to present with the same symptom, a flat tyre. Now, this sort of approach has been widely used in neuroscience for decades, and it's taught us an immense amount about how the brain works. For instance, if an individual has a stroke in the left hemisphere and the Broca's area, they'll present with impaired speech. However, when we take this approach in many mental health conditions, it doesn't work. And so we may be asking the wrong question. Advances in neuroimaging can give us a different perspective. Because when we try this original approach, specifically in Tourette's, we don't find any convergence in locations. So applying a different technique now, we'll give you another scenario in town B. We again have 3 residents complaining of a flat tire. But when we map their routes, we don't find any overlap across all participants that might explain the flat tire. There's a few sections with red and blue that have overlapped, but none of them have any overlap with purple. So what explains the common presentation of a flat tire? If instead we ask, what was the purpose, what was the function of their journey? We can see that all individuals were travelling between the university and the library. They were commuting on what we might call the educational network. Now, unbeknownst to us, but the library and the university have been working together to upgrade their infrastructure between campuses. And we find out one of the tracks does have a pothole, that some tradesmen dropped some nails on another part of the road, and there's still some unsealed road with sharp shrapnel. So what we see here is that regardless of the location of the risk, as long as individuals were travelling along the same educational network, they were presenting with the same symptom. So if we take this approach in looking at the brain in Tourette syndrome, look for what might explain structural differences, we actually find a very clear functional network that explains the different risk locations. Now, this network reveals something really interesting. When we first set out to look at this, we weren't trying to look at premonitory urge. We were simply trying to find brain regions that were different in Tourette's. Now, it's hypothesized that some of the brain regions involved might be the motor regions, regions involved in movement. And while we did see some activation in a few of these regions, what struck us about this network was the areas of the brain involved in urge for action. Now, to verify that these truly were urge to action regions, we took our Tourette's network and we had a look at the overlap between the brain regions involved in other common natural urges, such as to cough, to swallow, micturition, which is the need to urinate, and blinking. And what we found was clear overlap in key regions of this urge to action network. So what is the role of this urge to action network in Tourette's? Are we actually seeing what patients have been describing and telling us all these years? Does it drive premonitory urge? We simply don't know. But we do know that premonitory urges are very, very important. The recurrent cycle of urge build-up and relief is thought to negatively reinforce the tics that keep them going. And so recent interventions, behavioural interventions that have thought to tap into this, such as CBIT for short, this intervention involves urge awareness for the participant and gets them to tap into that urge awareness and to modulate their behavioural response to these urges. So it's centred around the patient experience. So independently, we're finding that patients are reporting that premonitory urges are the most important clinical feature for themselves. Clinicians are now implementing an intervention to modulate this premonitory urge. And neuroscience is backing up the idea that the urge parts of the brain might play a key role in Tourette's. So we're embarking on a brand new study that for the first time we're mapping both the subjective experience of premonitory urge as well as the objective brain activity associated with premonitory urge. This requires an interdisciplinary approach with clinicians, neuroscience, and first-person experience, which has been utilised very little in the field. The clinicians will be implementing clinical scales of premonitory urge and starting the intervention of CBIT. The first-person experience will elicit qualitative, subjective experience of urge and how that changes as a result of CBIT. We're collaborating with philosophers in HAS to help us understand these first-person experiences. And then lastly, involving brain imaging, we'll be scanning these participants to look at brain activation associated with premonitory urge. To increase urge, we ask the participants to suppress their tics, which increases the urge. However, to be able to see how this relates to the urge network, we also need some sort of control. We can't have control participants without Tourette's because they can't suppress their tics. They don't have premonitory urges. So to probe this, we're also giving them the challenge of suppressing blinks. Now, while they're doing these tasks, whether it's blink or tick suppression, we're also gauging from them real-time ratings of their urge. So by collecting information from multiple perspectives, including information from the participants themselves, which is rarely done, we hope to recast long-held assumptions about what the most important aspects of Tourette's is, to help find solutions to problems that patients think are most important, and ultimately to ensure better health outcomes for Tourette's.